via a cable communication that had been closed down between the Soviets and the British during the 1948 Berlin airlift. From the Soviet High Command was a note saying, "We will not forget what you've done for us this night." No one's been told that story before.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
So, an extraordinary night of euphoria in Berlin. Within hours of East Germany's decision to let its people go by opening the border to the west, the city erupted in a frenzy of celebration. East German border guards watched as jubilant crowds danced on the infamous Berlin Wall that's divided Europe for a generation.
Astonishing news from East Germany, where the East German authorities have said, in essence, that the Berlin Wall doesn't mean anything anymore.
But tonight, there were no filters, no checks. At midnight, the border was thrown open and the crowd surged through the open gates.
We want to have the experience to go this way, and we want to go back to our country.
You don't want to stay in the West?
No, never.
This is not a normal night. There is astonishing news from East Germany. We are witnessing the end of an era. After 28 years, the East German government is throwing open its borders to the west, turning the Berlin Wall into a relic of the Cold War, and possibly opening a whole new page in European history.
Our interview today is with Iain MacGregor, the author of a new book on Checkpoint Charlie. Weaving together personal testimonies, this book is described as a gripping narrative with vivid interviews with those on all sides whose lives were directly affected by that grim symbol of the East-West divide that poisoned Europe for almost a century. Now, if you like the podcast, you can help to support us from $3 a month. You'll be helping to cover the show's increasing costs and keep us on the air, plus you get a Cold War Conversations drinks coaster too. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. So, back to today's episode. Iain MacGregor tells us some great stories from the history of Checkpoint Charlie, featuring a number of guests from the podcast, as well as a number of stories unknown to me. We welcome Iain MacGregor to our Cold War conversation.
My dad was in Korea, and he was in the British Army of the Rhine in the 50s. So as I was growing up in the late 60s, early 70s, he was telling me about his adventures that he had as a conscript. And he'd done his R&R in West Berlin, so I knew about that. And then jump quite a few years, I did my degree in modern history, and my dissertation was on the Prague Spring of 1968. And that was primarily because my dad had put me on a student exchange to Leningrad in 1981, which I found fascinating. And ever since then, I've just been fascinated by the Cold War, which is why I chose the degree I did. It's why I did the dissertation I did. And some of my best books that I've published have been on the Cold War too.
Wow. Well, it sounds like we might have to get you back on an episode to talk about your exchange in Leningrad. We're here tonight to talk about your book about Checkpoint Charlie. Now, one of my questions was going to be, why did you choose Checkpoint Charlie as a subject? But after hearing your Cold War background and the subject you did your dissertation on, I think it's pretty obvious as to why you chose it.
Yes, but I mean, I'll let you in on a little secret. In the job I'm in, you can obviously, I mean, your listeners might know this, they might not know this, but generally in the literary world, you deal with literary agents, and they're selling you, pitching you ideas from their authors about he wants to write this. And you could be Simon Sharma, you could be Max Hastings, you could be anyone. You still have to do a proposal. But sometimes in my role, it's you're obviously looking for ideas yourself, and you'll pitch the idea you have to a famous author that you think would best serve the project, because then you'll sell more books and it'll be a commercial success. So the idea for the Berlin Wall had been on my back burner for at least 4 years, if not even 5 years, because in my mind's eye, I'm thinking, well, 2019 is going to be the 30th anniversary. That's a big deal. This is way before Brexit, obviously. So I was working up the idea anyway. But the more I was doing the research, because that's what I do, I'll do lots of research to see whether it's viable, what possible angle could it take, who could be in it, what would we talk about. You work on all those types of ideas. And the more I was digging and the more passionate I was getting about it, I mean, I was reading dozens of books and I was talking to lots of people. I ended up thinking, actually, I want to write this because I've got as much knowledge as anyone else, and I've got the passion for it, and I've got the background. I mean, my dad was served here, so that was the reason. And then, so for the last 3.5 years, I've been doing. I mean, I spent nearly 2 years just doing the research, and by that I mean interviewing over 70 people, going here, there, and everywhere to meet with them. Dealing with translators, all that kind of thing. And then for the last year or so, it's been writing the book.
Right. And a very interesting cast you have in the book as well. How did you decide which stories you were going to include?
I was trying to, what I did was I drew up the chronology of the life of the Berlin Wall. Obviously, a few years before, because you have to set the story for the reader, because obviously a lot of your listeners will be quite expert at knowing what happened to the Berlin Wall and what happened to Berlin in general after the Second World War. But this is a mass market book, so there'll be a lot of readers picking this up that won't know anything about it. So if you want to set the story straight, that's what I did. I drew out the chronology, and then judging by the people I was talking to, I was trying to expertly fit in their stories throughout the chronology of the lifespan, of the wall itself. So in the book, some of the characters turn up several times in these 28 years, whereas some just appear at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end.
No, and that works really well with the young soldier at the start, who then returns to Berlin at the end as the general commanding the British forces, which is really good. That sort of thread follows through the book and works really well.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to try and get at least one military voice and at least a couple of civilian voices that would keep popping up throughout the book, or would be nice bookends to the story. So the person you just mentioned is Major General Sir Robert Corbett, who was the last British commandant of the British sector in 1989. So he witnessed and had to deal with the events that just exploded all around him. But what people don't know is he was a young first lieutenant in the Irish Guards who, a couple of months after the wall had gone up in that winter of 1961, found himself transporting a goods train through the inter-German border to get into West Berlin because they needed the supplies. And so in a way, it's great because you see what the wall was like right at the beginning through the eyes of this very impressionable 22, 23-year-old officer. But then you get the picture of what had happened to the city itself and how the wall had evolved and what that meant for the East Berliners who were living with it, because Sir Robert was now the commandant and he had access into East Berlin on various either official duties or just his wife going there shopping, which I talk about as well. So it brings the story 360 degrees.
Yeah, no, works really well. And you tease out some stories there of incidents that people are probably familiar with, but are hearing it from a slightly different angle. One of the stories I particularly liked was the 1961 crisis at the Berlin Wall, where the Soviet tanks and the American tanks are toe to toe.
Yeah.
And the US soldier who's in East Berlin, and he's trying to identify whether they are East German or Soviet tanks.
Yeah. I mean, that's that story has been told before. That's Lieutenant Werner Pike, but what I wanted to do was I got a fresh interview with him, obviously. So I was lucky enough to be in New York when he was coming up from North Carolina, where he lives, to see some friends in Jersey. So we agreed to rendezvous in Manhattan, and I interviewed him with his wife. And that's a great story as well, because I'm a father of twins, and Werner, his wife, was pregnant with twins when all this was going on, when the tank standoff was happening, and she was in their accommodation in the barracks in West Berlin when he was at Checkpoint Charlie, being given this job by his officer to go over there and find out who was actually in those tanks. So listeners might not know the story, but I mean, it's this event was almost as dangerous as the Cuban Missile Crisis a little while later. So this was when the Soviets tried to press on behalf of their East German subordinates how far they could push the Allies into falling back on their rights to actually go into East Berlin. So what started off as an American diplomat going into East Berlin with his wife to just go to the theatre, because that was very popular with Allied soldiers and foreign dignitaries. They loved to go to the big theatres that were in East Berlin that had been restored, so cheap, and all these international stars would go there and perform. So that's what he was doing. He was just going there for a night out, and rather than just be waved through by the East German guards, as was the norm and which was agreed by the four powers, he was actually stopped, and the young East German officer, the border guard, asked for his identification, which was a complete no-no and wasn't agreed. And obviously he refused, and he was turned back. And within half an hour, back he came with a reinforced guard of American military police with bayonets drawn. And obviously he was let through that time. But this escalated until what happened was the general who was in charge of the American Berlin garrison and the hero of the 1948 Berlin airlift, General Lucius Clay, was now back in charge, put in there by President Kennedy, who hoped to try and restore some order. But Clay had other ideas, and he was definitely you could say, in inverted commas, a commie basher. He was not going to take a backward step at all. And if that meant he sent tanks down to Checkpoint Charlie to reinforce the message that they had freedom of movement across the border, that's what he did. And so on the grand scale, that's what he was doing. And from a very human side of the story, which is what I'm telling him in the book, Lieutenant Pike was the guy who was given the job of finding out, are those guys in those tanks who aren't wearing insignia. The Russians were very clever. They made sure their tankers could not be identified. But so he was given the job.
Something they've tried out again more recently as well.
It's a very good tactic. Yeah, it's a very good tactic. It clearly works, and it's Putin's taken that from the 1961 playbook. But so he went over there and just used his common sense of what he could do to try and find out who these guys were, crept up on them, looked at what they were reading, and found out they were reading Russian. Obviously newspapers are in Cyrillic, and he got back to his commanding officer and gave them the news. But interestingly, talking to a lot of the American veterans, some of them, there's an urban myth, and whether it's true or not, it'll probably come out in years to come when they release the records. There's an urban myth that there were 2 CIA, maybe 3 or 4 CIA operatives there that actually found out the same information, but their way was they kept throwing stones at a Russian tank until the tanker opened the lid, came out and swore at them in Russian. And then they hot-legged it back and said, yep, they're Russian.
That's a great story if it's true. I like that.
I would love it to be true. Well, as an author, you think, I would love that to be true.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And as you say, it's not purely the military side you look at as well. It's quite interesting, the journalist's story as well that you cover.
Yeah, I mean, that was the point. I mean, I'm at pains to tell people that are interviewing me for the book that it's not just a military story. I mean, the city, there's a couple of million people living there, and the majority of them were civilians. I mean, obviously, the city itself, both east and west, there's a heck of a lot of military hardware there. There's a lot of personnel. The hinterland is surrounded by hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and tanks. So there's a big military presence. But I wanted to capture what life was like, just the everyday, the monotony, what it was like going from east to west or west to east. And I captured that mainly through one of the journalists that I think you're referring to, Mark Wood, who was a Reuters correspondent. And he was there in the mid 70s, right the way through to about 79, 80. And yeah, I mean, he lived a very, I would say, chaotic, colourful life, doing his job, reporting on you would say maybe a bit boringly, how the East German economy was doing. That was his job for Reuters. But it was just everything else that he reported on. I mean, some of the things he did, what's in the book is only the tip of the iceberg. But he told me some very funny stories. So he was living in the flat where Frederick Forsyth had originally lived. It was bugged. All over the apartment was bugged by the Stasi. They had the listening room was about 4 doors down, and he knew it was there, and they knew he knew it was there. He was tailed every day. 2 doors down on the other side was an East German border guard that he knew very well, that would be going down to Checkpoint Charlie to do his job every day. So it's just the bizarre life that he led was, to me, fascinating.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because we interviewed Peter Miller on the podcast, Reuters, and he was describing pretty similar stories there as well.
I mean, one of the stories I tell is generally Mark would be waiting in line with everyone else, trying to get through the queue to get through Checkpoint Charlie, and very stern officers. He makes a point of telling us, he describes it in detail, how the East German border guards, maybe their job was quite monotonous, but they took great pleasure in barking at people who didn't understand that the East Berlin side of Berlin was the capital, and they made sure that everyone knew it. And he just found himself suddenly being befriended strangely by the officer on duty, who normally ignored him, and the guy wanted to Mark to get him out of a spot because they had a Turkish tourist who was heavily pregnant, whose waters had broke, and they just wanted to get her back over to the western side as quickly as possible because they didn't want to have to deal with it, because they knew the paperwork would be extraordinary. And Mark helped them out and jumped in the ambulance, and he says it's probably the only time a vehicle has managed to just go hell for leather through all the chicanes, through the eastern side of Checkpoint Charlie, through to the west, to the point of which the American guards had weapons cocked, thinking something's going on here. This never happens. And that's just one of the bizarre stories he tells that's in the book.
That was an amazing story. And I was going to ask you about that. So this was an East German ambulance crossing into West Berlin.
Yeah, just to take the woman over the border to get her back so she could have her baby on the western side, because it would have been probably for them a bureaucratic nightmare. They did love their paperwork, after all.
Yes, yeah, but really I wonder whether the ambulance crew came back.
I think they would have. I mean, Mark was held up for a while, and he was questioned, and then I think, I'm not sure, I think they either transferred the woman onto a West Berlin medical vehicle, or maybe he never actually said, but maybe the East German ambulance took her straight through to the hospital.
Yeah.
But I would imagine those guys came back.
Yeah. Yeah. No, fascinating story. And then, you know, one of the other ones that stands out, and I had sort of, I think I listened to a podcast or something about the Springsteen concert held in East Berlin.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing because, and again, I'll hold my hand up. In my day job, I published Bruce Springsteen's autobiography in the UK, so I'm a huge fan. So I've been to see him several times. I've got all his albums, you know, the usual. I won't bore you, but it just seemed logical to have the story in there because obviously 1988, Bruce is huge. He's as big as he is now. He's probably bigger then than he is now. I mean, he was this huge global behemoth doing these huge world tours, famous for doing 3 to 4 hour shows at a time in front of hundreds of thousands of people, especially the big outdoor events. And his Tunnel of Love tour of that year just happened to coincide with the fact that a younger guard were coming up to the higher echelons of power in the SED, the socialist government of these German states. And they persuaded Honecker that it would be a great thing to do if they could have someone of Springsteen's caliber to do a show in East Berlin. It showcased the city, it showcases how forward-thinking, youth-orientated the East German government was. And I think they probably saw Springsteen's blue-collar credentials as something akin to what they were trying to do in the GDR. But that's at a higher level. And what I wanted to do was obviously talk about that and talk about what had been going on for the last few years in East Berlin, seeing all these big American and British rock stars that were playing in West Berlin, like David Bowie, Bryan Adams, those kind of people. But then looking at Springsteen's event was, I think, a key moment in how East Germans saw themselves and saw that what was tantalizingly dangling in front of them, if only they could reach out and get it, by watching this guy perform. It was, you know, all their Christmases rolled into one. The security of the event was quite standoffish, very East German-like. These kids were allowed to just go crazy, in obviously in a rock and roll way. They weren't smashing the place up, but they say, and it looks like it when you watch the film of the event, it's at least 150, 200,000 there. They were only expecting about 70, 75, and, you know, triple that turned up. And it went down really well. He did an amazing performance. He says one of the best of his career. He still says out of the hundreds or thousands of gigs he's done in his career, that's in his top 3. And obviously there was shenanigans backstage about what kind of message he was going to say to the crowd when it came to talking about why he was there, that kind of thing. So it was fascinating. And so to interview East Germans that went to the show and the West Berliners who managed to get across there as well. And then I was really lucky to interview Springsteen's manager, John Landau, for his take on the background to the event and the interplay with the East German state as well.
Yeah, because it gets sort of quite complicated, doesn't it, with this whole the East German state trying to link it to the Nicaraguan cause.
Yeah, I mean that was that's straight out of Life of Brian almost. The Judean People's Front and all that kind of thing. It was basically the youth league of the SED had invited him, and that's why he was going. But then John Landau, his manager, and Bruce, the first inkling they got that the gig itself was being exploited for political reasons was when they were in the hotel the day before the gig. So they'd arrived the day before. They were in the best hotel on offer you could have in East Berlin, where most dignitaries stayed, and anyone would want to stay there. And that's when John Landau spotted the flyers that obviously said proceeds from the gig would be going to the rebels in Nicaragua. And obviously that went down like a lead balloon with Springsteen. That wasn't what he was about. If he was going to take sides in a political debate, he would be the one to do it, not have someone else say he was doing it. And that almost cancelled the gig. And obviously the authorities had to do a very quick apology and vault face and change the the promotion of the event. But I didn't actually. It's a shame I didn't get it in the book, but I've actually got one of the tickets that has that livery on it that says proceeds were going to the rebel group in Nicaragua. But I didn't get it put in the book.
Oh well, we'd love to see a photo of that.
Yeah, it's well, I'm a fan, so I'm thinking, wow, this is amazing. So hopefully it might go in the ebook.
Okay, good. And obviously, as you said, the book's set in a sort of chronological order. I think one of the things I particularly like about the book is you have a number of guests from the podcast in there as well.
I do indeed. You were very kind to help me set them up. So Nigel Dunkley from Bricksmith, who you've obviously interviewed, was a fascinating interview. I mean, weirdly, I had been talking to Nigel. I'd met him in Berlin, I think about 6 months before you interviewed him. But we just literally had a coffee for an hour or so in Potsdamer Platz, actually. And he wanted to show me the last tower that was still in central Berlin. And you can go up there and everything. And the locals call it the last of the Mohicans. And he was just great. I mean, as you know, he's a very gregarious, outgoing man. What I like about Nigel was he has a real zest for life, and he acts as if nothing phases him. But then when you really drill down to the things he saw, the missions he was on in the East German hinterland outside of Berlin, I mean, the guy deserves a medal. Simple as that. I mean, very brave. Could have easily, if not killed, then seriously injured in some of the scrapes he got into with, East German and Soviet military vehicles chasing him, trying to ram his car off the road. As a lot of, obviously, as you know, Bricksmith and the US and the French liaison teams had, it was a real cat and mouse game they played with the Soviets and the East German Stasi. A few people were killed in, inverted commas, traffic accidents. One couple were shot and killed. So even though I say at the start of the chapter it's called Catch Me If You Can, I mean, these guys were playing for keeps. And so talking to someone like Nigel, I thought was revelatory.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're right about Nigel. He is a great character. And I think that character and self-effacing character very much as well comes across in the interview. And I have been working with a number of Bricksmiths soldiers as well, and I do a talk on Bricksmiths, which I've done a couple of times, and there's always a group of former Bricksmiths personnel turn up, and they are, well, it's just the job, we just did it and whatever, but they really were in the front line and were putting their life at risk. And that's when the term Cold War is a sort of a misnomer for certainly for Bricksmiths.
Absolutely. And when you also think that they were our eyes and ears in where the Warsaw Pact were operating. And I think as the Soviets were doing with us as well. So, I mean, they had their liaison team looking at what we were doing. And I think that kept, as the saying goes, everyone honest. So both sides, because they had their feelers out in each other's territories, I think it did lower the temperature to a degree of what each side was capable of in terms of technology and hardware, what was coming online, that kind of thing. But I do think that our guys were just superbly brave at doing what they did, with a real sense of joie de vivre in a way. I mean, that's what I think you're saying, what you get from Nigel. Other guys that I'm like you, other guys I talked to were very similar. And an interesting thing was with definitely when I was interviewing Major General Sir Robert Corbett, he thought the same thing. I mean, he's one of the guys that's behind not a huge campaign, but he's definitely behind a campaign at the moment to get the personnel of Bricksmith recognized with a campaign medal. And I hope he's successful because they obviously deserve it. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you also speak to the opposition technically with Torsten, who we had on one of our episodes. Well, he actually appeared in 4, I think. I was speaking to him for so long, I had to chop that up into multiple episodes.
Yeah, he was incredible, and I'm so grateful for you putting me his way so I could interview him myself. Because I mean that's key, because I didn't want the story to be top heavy in a perspective from the west of Berlin. I thought it was, if I could, I wanted to interview as many East Germans as possible, which I did, whether they were civilians or in the police or obviously in the security services, which is the police, I suppose. But then Torsten was just fantastic and fascinating as well, because obviously his experiences are right at the end of the story, when he's cocooned away in his academy, which was on the Czech border, if I'm correct. Yep. If my memory serves me well. And so for him to open up about what life was like for these guys who were suddenly confronted with, well, it looks like the end of our state because there's a revolution going on and we're in deadly danger, and we're going to give you very perfunctory riot control training, and then we're shipping you into Berlin and you're going to have to deal with it. I mean, just incredible. I mean, obviously you think Tiananmen Square had only been 7-8 months before that, and that's exactly what happened there. They bust in conscripts from hundreds and hundreds of miles away who had no idea what was going on. All they were told were they were facing the enemy, and you saw what happened. And that could easily have happened in East Germany.
Yeah, I think there's quite a strong argument that Tiananmen Square itself probably could have been a reason why no live ammunition was used in East Germany.
No, I completely agree. I think the powers that be, especially after Honecker had been ousted and Krenz is in charge, and with his associates, they weren't stupid. They realized, do we want to go this way? Knowing full well that Gorbachev is just not going to back us at all. He's already pulled out. He's told Honecker he's not going to back us anymore. So. And obviously, Krenz had taken control with the full backing of the Kremlin anyway. So I think the last thing on his mind was, we're going to send out the troops on the streets and start shooting people. I think that was never going to happen. I think that I had picked up conversations from a couple of guys in the Stasi hierarchy that I talked to, who said that there were phone calls at the very top between military men about could they send in some motorized units to try and shore the regime up, but then that was quickly put to bed.
Yeah. I think you mentioned Heinz Kessler, who I think was the defense minister in that section, and it's really interesting how what was outwardly a really solid hardline regime just sort of fell apart. It's it's jaw dropping. I mean, I was in the last year of my degree in Manchester, and I was just watching it on TV, thinking, with my housemates, thinking, how the hell has that happened? This is just crazy. I mean, obviously hindsight's a great thing, and if you look at the time lapse between what was going on in Gdansk, Polish shipyards, how Poland's slowly changed, and democracy was getting, or spreading, I should say, from the shipyards itself. Martial law wasn't working there, and then how that spread like dominoes. It's like an inverted domino theory, but for the communists instead of us, and how one by one they fell. But primarily, I think it was the time was up, and the East Germans, they were fed up of the travel restrictions, and by hook or by crook, there was more to life than just going to Czechoslovakia or Poland on holiday. Yeah.
And the system was bankrupt as well, which is what I say in the book. I mean, as soon as Krenz took control and got to see the financial books, so to speak, of where the country was at, I mean, he knew the writing was on the wall. And I think that probably played a part in him saying, well, we're not going to back this up by getting heavy-handed. What's the point?
Yeah, he'd be a great interview. Did you try and speak to him or not?
I did try, never got anywhere, but he gave an interview I saw a couple of weeks ago, actually. It was I saw it on the BBC website.
Yes. Yeah, no, you're right. And there's a very long interview with English subtitles with a German journalist, I think, shortly after he came out of prison.
Yeah, it was very, I mean, I can give you my opinion anyway. When I was in the main, when I was interviewing East German officials, border guards, Torsten was the only exception. The rest were, I wouldn't say paranoid, but they were fretful. I always had to submit my questions to them beforehand. I had to have a translator with me to make sure everything was picked up and there was no confusion. And a couple of times they insisted that we meet in public, in a public place. Completely the opposite to everyone else I talked to. It was literally like you and I are doing right now. We're just talking down the line. Yeah.
Interesting. How did you get on finding Soviet people?
That's just me being a bit of a gumshoe. I just went online, looked at face group sites, then on the internet in general, and picked up a couple of names. And then a good friend of yours of the show, Michael Rafferty, put me in contact as well.
Yeah, with Vitali. Yeah.
Yeah, so he was good too. But generally, it's the same with guys that were American, British, and French. You talk to one of them. I mean, you know this anyway with what you're doing. You talk to someone, you have a really good interview with them, and at the end of it, they'll say, "Oh, by the way, you should talk to so and so because he's got a great story." Yeah. And one can lead on to the other if you win their trust and they know you want to tell the most accurate story possible.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. I mean that has worked, and I've speaking to people who I never thought I would end up speaking to, and it's really off the back of that reference to say, look, this guy you can trust. He's going to give you a good interview. What I found interesting is you get to obviously the opening of the wall, and you speak to my good friend Michael there, but in all of the research you did, what was the most surprising thing you would say that you discovered?
Probably I'd say just from an international incident, the story that Major General Sir Robert Corbett told me about persuading the Soviet guards around the Brandenburg Soviet Memorial by the Brandenburg Gate, to stand down the night the wall was coming down, because again, your listeners probably know this, but where the Soviet memorial was, it was inside the British sector. So throughout time, the history of the wall, obviously once the pressure had died down from the early years of the wall being built, the Soviets were always allowed daily to go through to the Soviet War Memorial, to have a guard there, to one guard off, one guard on, that kind of thing. And obviously on Memorial Day, they had their big anniversary celebrations there too, commemorations, I should say. So you've got these guys, these young Soviet conscripts at the memorial watching events unfold around them, with West Berliners scrambling to get over the fence and the barrier. They're probably thinking, what the hell's going on? Do we start firing back at these guys? And that's the situation Major General Corbett came to. He was called and told in no uncertain terms he had to get over there because they thought shooting was going to start. That's where he went. He got them in the guard room, got them all standing around him while he sat in the middle, and he's in fatigues. He's in his army fatigues because it was such. He's obviously having such a frantic night going all along the British sector to find out what's going on November the 9th, and he tells them via a translator he doesn't know what's going on in the other sectors, but all he does know is while they're in his sector, the British sector, no harm would come to them. And he said that he could then see them all kind of their shoulders go down in relief. They then gave him an honor guard as he goes out the door. And as he's jumping in his Jeep and driving off to the next crisis that evening, he gets a a call over the walkie-talkie from the head of Bricksmith saying, "Can I see you? I need to see you urgently." So he drives over to the main HQ, and they say, "You need to read this. This memo's come through, and it's just surreal." And what it was via a cable communication that had been closed down between the Soviets and the British, and it had been closed down during the 1948 Berlin airlift by Stalin, because obviously he was so hacked off with what was going on. This communication cable had been reopened, and from the Soviet High Command was a note saying, "We will not forget what you've done for us this night." And no one's been told that story before. So that was amazing to hear, and obviously to sit in Sir Robert's study while he's telling me all this was just incredible. And then a very interesting epilogue to that is he gets presents sent to him every year, whether it's really expensive vodka, a general's Soviet hat with lovely braid and velvet, crushed velvet. Every year he gets presents.
And that was one of the standout pieces in the book. There's a number of standout pieces, but that was one where I thought, I've never heard that story before. And the thought of Soviet troops opening fire on that night and what that might have set off
doesn't
bear thinking about. No, absolutely not.
Yeah. And at that time you still had, as we just talked about, you had some of the East German military top brass were talking actively to each other, saying, "Can we mobilize units?" So it doesn't take much to put two and two together if these kind of things do happen. On the smallest event, can big events happen? Obviously, as we've seen throughout history. So yeah, I mean, I think it's obvious it was so important because from that communication that they received from the Soviet High Command afterwards.
Yeah, no, amazing stuff. And I just going right to the start of the book, I did like your dedication, which I presume is to your father.
Yes. So my dad was a national serviceman. He was in the 1st Northamptonshires. So my family's originally from northeast Scotland. And with a name like MacGregor, it's got to be from somewhere up there. He'd moved down in the 50s before he was conscripted, so he went into the 1st Northants, and they were in Korea right towards the end, and he was a UN peacekeeper there as well once the demarcation had been set up. And then he was 3 years, I think, in the British Army of the Rhine. So I've got lots of photographs of him there. So whether he was on training or in West Berlin or whatever. And then the other name is Ivor Robertson, and he was national service. He was my uncle, my mother's elder brother, and he was the other side of the family that had stayed up in Scotland, didn't move down south, and he was in the Seaforth Highlanders. So he saw service in Germany. So I just thought it was very apt. I thought if I'm going to dedicate it to anyone, I should dedicate it to them too.
Yeah, no, it was very apt indeed. And do you have any Cold War memorabilia from that?
Well, I've got lots of photographs from my dad's army career, and a lot of those are from Germany. I've got trying to think. I've got lots of badges that I bought when I was in Leningrad, but that's like 1981, so it doesn't really count. But as you know, you've probably been to Berlin. It's so full of bric-a-brac now. It's slightly teetering on the tacky side.
Well, it's interesting you were going to say that, because one of my last questions was how you feel about the commercialization of Checkpoint Charlie.
Well, I'll tell you an interesting story, if I may.
Yeah.
So I'd done one of the standout chapters, a very emotional chapter, and I really, really enjoyed the interview process for it, was talking about the death of Peter Fechter, and in 1962, and he was the famously, for all the wrong reasons, he was the young East German bricklayer, basically, who dressed like Elvis and just wanted, as any young kid would, he just wanted to sample the excitement of West Berlin and living in the West. And he was fed up of the dreariness and nothing to buy, no fun to have in East Berlin at that time. And so, being dared by the gang he roamed around East Berlin with, him and a friend tried to get across Checkpoint Charlie, obviously when the wall's up. The death strip was in its infancy. His friend made it, and he slipped on the final hurdle of getting over the final wall and was shot, mortally wounded, but then left for dead. And it took him 2 to 3 hours to bleed to death. And obviously for the first hour, he's screaming in pain. The East Germans didn't know what to do, because obviously they follow a very strict take your orders from above. So the guys who had shot him were waiting for their officer to arrive to say what to do next. The Americans weren't going to go into East German territory to give him first aid or to rescue him, because they couldn't. And by then a big crowd of civilians were obviously watching, because obviously there was a lot of flats that overlooked the area around Friedrichstrasse. And so it became a big international incident. So I tell that story. And it's shocking. And Margaret Hosseini was a young West Berliner who witnessed this I think she was 18, and she'd been to a party that night nearby, and so her and her friends watched what was going on. And she now lives in Barnes in West London, and she's nearly 80. And it was a great interview with her, because obviously I talk about her earlier in the book as well, about what was it like before the war and when the war was going up. But to get back to what I'm talking about, is there's now a lovely, very basic, very simple monument to Peter Fechter, and it's about 150 yards to the left, going down Zimmerstrasse, away from Checkpoint Charlie. And there's always flowers there. Someone always lays some flowers. I've been there several times. And so one time I was there, it was summer, and I walked back up the 150 yards back to Checkpoint Charlie, where, as you know, it's really busy. It's a big throng of tourists. Everyone's taking photos of the reenactors by the renovated hut. Or you can go into the museum, or you can go into one of many burger bars and bric-a-brac shops. And I went up to the American guard, and he did speak. He was German, but he spoke very good English. And he thought I was going to pay him to have a photograph. And I said, well, no, I hope you don't mind. I just want to ask you a couple of questions, because I'm writing a book about Checkpoint Charlie. He went, yeah, sure, no problem. So we just started talking about his job, and it led up to the one question I really wanted to ask him. And I said, well, you're at Checkpoint Charlie. Do you know what's down that street by about 150 yards? And he looked at me puzzled and said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, the monument to Peter Fechter. And he looked at me and said, who? And then so I spent the next 15 minutes telling him what I'm telling you now about Peter Fechter. And he said, wow, that's an incredible story. I didn't know about that. And he's the guy you're going to get a photo with at Checkpoint Charlie.
Unbelievable. I mean, and I think that's the sad thing, because I went to, the first time I went to Berlin was in June '89, so it looked like the wall was going to be there for forever, and cross through Checkpoint Charlie. And it certainly lived up to expectation of what I thought it would be like in terms of its rigor. But I always found one of the most touching things as you walked around, the more remote parts of the wall were these odd memorials to people who died trying to cross. And I remember the Fechter one, further down Zimmerstrasse as well.
Well, I was going to say, though, you say that, but I would argue that obviously for all the victims that died trying to cross the wall, whether underneath it, over it, crashing through it, flying over it in a balloon or whatever, and all the ones that died, there were obviously those white crosses that dot all along the border in the central section of Berlin. And they're poignant. They're still there, and they're well maintained. But as you know, there's hardly any points of the wall that you could. I mean, it's all gone. I mean, apart from one or two sections that are obviously, quite rightly, they're tourist points, and the Berlin War Museum's at one section of it. They've completely done away with it. And I can understand why they wanted to smash through it. They wanted to get rid of it. It was abhorrent. But it's in hindsight, I think I wish they'd kept a bit more of it, just so you could understand how, as you just said, immovable this thing seemed. And how deadly it was.
Yeah, it's difficult for people to get a concept of what it was, because I think, there's a lot of tourists who just think it was a wall. They don't realize that there was about 3 walls. I think scarily some people get confused around Nazism and the GDR as well, and the Berlin Wall, because it's all lumped together as German history.
Yes. Yes.
And obviously people who listen to this podcast are not in that not in that category. But yeah, it's tricky, that whole Checkpoint Charlie thing. I just find it quite uncomfortable with the fake hut and the fake soldiers, and it just jars a bit for me. But then you can't preserve everything.
No, it's true. And I suppose it's unlike to the Checkpoint Charlie Museum, because obviously the guys that run that, they did play a pivotal role in the history of the Berlin Wall. So when obviously the wall was up, their lone voice of protest and trying to show how deadly the wall was and how abhorrent the GDR state was in the way it had built this thing and was killing its citizens trying to escape, their work was really important. And that's captured when you go into that museum, which is obviously just to the left or right, wherever you're looking at it, of Checkpoint Charlie. That's an important museum. And I wouldn't want to say that what they do isn't important, but I think when you're looking at the checkpoint itself now, I mean, you're surrounded by souvenir shops and burger bars, and I think that's wrong. I think if it really was such an important part of Berlin history, maybe it should have a bit more dignity around it.
Well, you could argue that it's as an important part of Berlin history as the Brandenburg Gate.
Yeah, I would agree.
And yet
with that.
they wouldn't dream of knocking that, or
no, that's true.
Messing around with that. But then that's our view on it.
No, but what I wish they hadn't done is I would have loved it if you could still see even part of what the East German side of Checkpoint Charlie was like. Because obviously that you had the very simple hut on the Allied side, which signified that, well, we're only sticking a wooden hut here because we don't actually think that you have sovereign territory and therefore we don't respect it. So we're just sticking a hut here to show you that. Whereas obviously you go to the East German side and it was a huge complex. I mean, massive, spent millions of pounds on it, that obviously processed hundreds of thousands of people going back and forward every year, especially obviously get into the 80s and they were allowing lots of tourists to come through. I just wish they kept a little bit of that, because that's history as well, if not more significant.
Yeah, and there were significant bits of it even through the early 90s were still there when I revisited Berlin a couple of times during that period. But
there is a section that they've discovered, isn't there? They discovered it a year ago and they announced it this summer. I think it's in the southwest side of Berlin, southeastern side of Berlin, sorry. And it was overgrown, and they've discovered, I think, 250 yards of untouched wall. And so that's in a restoration program at the moment. So
it's too far for most tourists to get to. But for the hard Cold War, I struggle with a name because fan doesn't seem right. Cold War buff is probably the nearest I've got to, but I always struggle with a term for somebody who's really interested in the Cold War. So any listeners that come up with something better, I'd appreciate it.
That's true. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. But no, I mean, you mentioned Soviet soldiers with their insignia taken off. If you look at what's happening now, the book I've written is just as important to understand what's going on right now, because the Cold War's, I don't think the Cold War's over. It's just taken on a new lease of life, really. I mean, we may not have Berlin surrounded by anyone, but the same. I wouldn't call this. I'm loath to say the Soviets are the enemy. They're not the enemy, but the same adversary is there. He's just in a different guise. He's probably using.
It's just the borders move
and a different weapon. It's digital now.
The book is called Checkpoint Charlie, The Cold War, the Berlin Wall, and the Most Dangerous Place on Earth. When does it come out, Ian?
Next Thursday, 24th of October.
So 24th of October, it comes out. By the time we publish this episode, it will already be published. There will be links in the show notes there for you to purchase the book. I highly recommend it. I was lucky enough to get an early preview copy of it, and it is a brilliant read. It's a very accessible book. It's got a range of areas it covers, and I just thought it read well. And there's some stories there that I didn't know about, and as my listeners will know, I'm avid Cold War reader, but there were some stories that I'd not heard there. So even if you think you know everything about Checkpoint Charlie, you should get this book.
I think they'll enjoy hearing the voices more than anything else, because at the end of the day, is what I said to the people that I was interviewing, it's their story. I'm the facilitator of telling their story. Obviously, I put in a bit of background history so the reader will understand why these people's voices are appearing where they appear, but fundamentally it's their story because they lived it.
It's a great read.
Thank you. That's so nice of you to say so.
If you'd like to buy the book and help the podcast, click on the link in your podcast app. There's further information on this episode in our show notes, which can also be found as a link in your podcast app. If you like what you're hearing, sign up to our email list at coldwarconversations.com. And if you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group, where guests and listeners continue the Cold War conversation. Just search Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.